With an introduction like that, I'll be mute today. Anywho, so the Orient, I think you have all received Tasha's bio.
Yeah. Yes.
So the Oriental Institute has unearthed many treasures. Tasha is the real find. That's all I need to say. To say I love Tasha is redundant. I'm going to stop talking. I give you with deep pleasure, Dr. Tasha Vorderstrasse. Take it.
Thank you so much, Shoma. I feel like, yeah, I can't really live up to that, but I'll try. So today, what I wanted to talk to you about was something that I've been working on for a while. Let's see, we should now, there we go. And really sort of what I did today was put together, and some of you were here early, so you heard this a little bit, put together a whole bunch of different things that I've been working on and brought them together to try and better understand this statuette, which is the so-called Pompei Lakshmi. We'll see why this probably shouldn't be called the Pompei Lakshmi, but they've been calling it the Pompei Lakshmi since 1938, and the nickname is rather stuck. But how should we understand this figure? How should we understand this not just in Rome, or the Roman world, but also how do we understand it in the Indian world and the Indian milieu in which it came from? And beyond that, when we turn to things like the Ajanta caves and the fantastic wall paintings there, how can we see this beyond a ivory figure that now, as you see, is very white in color, but probably wasn't originally? How can we see this in the vivid color that I think it was? So that is what we're going to be looking at. Right, so what is this figure? Why is everyone so obsessed with this, as you'll see? And why have there been so many different ideas about it? And you might actually say, well, given the fact that everybody has published so much about it, what is there possibly new to say? But as we'll see, there's a lot to say, and not just what I'm saying, but what a lot of other people are saying. So the figurine, it's an ivory figurine, so carved from a single tusk of an Indian elephant. And it was found in 1938 in Pompei. So this is very helpful. Very rarely in archaeological context do we get contexts like Pompei. People love to find destruction levels. People find burn marks, and they're like, this is some historical event which I read about in some text, and therefore clearly the site was burned down at this point. But happily with Pompei, well, not so happily for the inhabitants, but happily for us, we know that Pompei is wiped out in 79 CE. Therefore, we know that this figurine must date before then, and this is extremely useful, as we'll see. So the figurine was found, as you can see, in pieces, and was painstakingly restored. As you can see, looks very good. Currently on display in the Archaeological Museum in Naples in the secret room. So that's where all the dubious things are on display, because of course, as we'll see shortly, this statue has been considered, in my opinion, not correctly, to be of dubious nature, even though I don't think that it is. But people took one look at it and went, oh no, and put it away. So as you can see from her, the figure is very elaborately outfitted. I think that's pretty clear when you look at this figure. Everything from her extremely elaborate hair, giant earrings, mini necklaces, mini bracelets of various sizes. We'll see the back in a second. You'll see it's equally elaborate. She has a belt and a sort of girdle with so you can't see it here, but we'll be discussing it. She actually is wearing a long skirt. You'll also see why not everybody thinks this, but it is, in my opinion, and we'll see, fairly clear that she is, even though right now it doesn't quite look like that. She has a bunch of little anklets and then a giant one on the bottom. Her legs are crossed, and she has two attendants who are similarly attired on either side, and she is barefoot. And she has one of her arms behind her back, which is actually highly unusual. Right. So if you look at the sides, so this piece was meant to be viewed in 3 dimensions, which is important. So this wasn't something that was just going to sit up against a wall. This was something that you were supposed to walk around and view. So you can see, we see her attendants similarly dressed. but not quite as elaborate necklaces, but a lot of bracelets, although not the big chunky ones that you saw that she's wearing. But again, clearly they have skirts. You can see that with the folds. And again, big earrings. Their hair is not quite as elaborate. You would have thought there would be better photos of this, but there's actually not, considering how much interest there is in this piece. So these are some of the best pictures. My apologies for the black and white. For some reason, people love to take her from the angle that's furthest to the left. They don't like the middle angle as well. I don't know why, but anyway, that's the case. And you can see she has another attendant on her other side, and then in her back, you see she has this incredibly elaborate hairstyle. You might argue, well, this is probably a wig, but we actually know from Janet Stevens, who was in Baltimore and works on Roman hairstyles, that you could indeed create things like this, it provided you had enough time and a hairdresser with enough patience. So this probably is her hair. And you can see, again, extremely elaborate. You can see the anklets here. So this is a very evocative statue. So you can see why people take one look at this and they're like, well, I wish to study this in great detail. And indeed, and this is just a example. So for those of you who are familiar with the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World and NYU, they're currently having a Pompei exhibition, and they just finished having a number of sessions on Indian figures in the Indian Ocean, and they had an entire session on the Pompei Lakshmi, who they refer to as the Pompei figurine, because they're trying to get away from the whole Lakshmi idea. But in any case, there's actually a video up about a sort of introduction to the figurine. It's about 7 minutes, and then they had some discussion. Further, you have people who really present themselves as people who study this, and this is their main area of expertise. So Laura Weinstein, who just published an article in 2021 on her Twitter handle picture is the Pompei Lakshmi, and one of the things she describes herself is as an expert on, as she calls it, the so-called Lakshmi. Right. So in 1939, Amadeo Maiuri was the superintendent of antiquities of Campania, and you can see him here. I'm not quite sure what he's doing with this statue, but anyway, he wrote about his discovery of the statue in 1938, and this is where the first problem starts. So as you can see, basically he says that the statue was found in Insula 9, Region 1 at Pompei at the time that they were digging the House of the Four Styles. Now, because he writes it in this way, this has caused a lot of people to think that the statue was found in the House of the Four Styles when it wasn't, when in fact it was found in, as he says, another big private house. Okay. So this caused the first issue. The second issue is that he says it's Insula 9, Region 1. So I did what we all do, which is go to the internet, of which there is tons of sites on Pompei. It's extremely helpful, and looked at Region 9, Insula 9, Region 1, which, as you can see, is here, and tried to find the House of the Four Styles to no success. In fact, the House of the Four Styles is in Region 1, Insula 8. Now, I'm not sure if the insulas changed numbers, not really sure what happened, but anyway, it's actually in Insula 8, so it's next door to Insula 9, so it's here. And the House of the Four Styles is here. And it was found at what is helpfully now called the Casa della Statuetta Indiana, or the House of the Indian Statuette, which is very useful because then we for sure know which it is. So you can see it here. Here's the entrance. So it's one of these large Pompeian houses, which has a narrow entryway. There's a taverna on one side, so you could obviously get your fast food, and then go straight in to sort of open up in the back, and you can see the excavations occurring here. Right. So if we look along the way, we can see that we have a variety of different houses, as I mentioned, bakeries, inns, the fruit vendor lives there in one of them, and this kind of thing. So basically, it seems to be, at least as it's presented, a fairly middling neighborhood, right? Not super rich, not super poor, just kind of, yeah, getting along as one does in Pompeii before the eruption wipes it all out. So it's a fairly typical large house in that it has an atrium when you go in, and then there's a peristyle courtyard with pillars, which is where the statuette was found. Now, who owned this house? And this has caused great consternation because in the house they found a graffito of a ship. My apologies, this is not a great picture, but in any case, everyone went, aha, a ship. A ship equals an Indian statuette equals a merchant's house. Well, maybe they just like ships. I don't really think this proves it's a merchant's house, and this merchant happened to be shipping things from India to Pompei. And indeed, if you look at other graffiti from the house, there's things like math problems and weird things about whoever sits in the chair will ... So I don't think anyone's arguing that there's a mathematician owning this house, for instance. So again, we don't really know who owned it. We don't have a lot of information. Now, the story is that it was found in a cabinet, or what appears to have been the remains of a cabinet in a chest. We have carbonized furniture from Herculaneum, which of course was also destroyed at the same time as Pompeii with the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And you can see the kinds of things where this would have been stored in the house. So it would have been kept in with the valuables. Now, this is important because a lot of people argue that this piece, as we'll see shortly, was part of a piece of furniture. So it would have originally been like, some sort of table leg, chair leg, that kind of thing. But by the time it was found, it wasn't found in it wasn't acting as a piece of furniture. It was actually found in a cabinet with a bunch of other glass and metal items. So clearly the family's valuables. So it had ceased to be whatever it had originally been and was being appreciated presumably as an art object. Now, we know that they kept statues in cabinets. So this is from the Casa de Vetti. These are the Cupids making perfume. But in the background, you can see a cupboard with a Venus statue in it. So this is not completely sort of out of it. In case you're wondering what the Cupids are doing here, this is this kind of thing that you often see in ancient art where people like to do sort of this comedic stuff, where this sort of upside down world kind of idea, right? So the idea that it's quite ridiculous. The Cupids are going to be making perfume, and they're also doing things like drinking out of amphora and all this kind of thing, and some of the other illustrations. So this is this sort of like the world has gone kind of weird, but it's very useful because as you can see how they would have stored things. We also know they had display tables. So this is an example of one from the 1st century CE where you can see this would have displayed something on it. So it might have originally sat on a stand and been out for people to enjoy. And then this is from Pompeii as well. And you can see this table and you can actually see how there's all these pieces on it, right? So there's a variety of ways that this could have been experienced by the viewers. Now, as I mentioned, there's a hole drilled at the top of the head. People have argued that this means that it's a mirror, although it seems like a very unhandy mirror. But anyway, people have argued for it to be a mirror. People have argued for it to be a piece of furniture. And then there's this problem, which is what's on the bottom. So on the bottom, there is this letter, which quite frankly doesn't mean much to me. But originally, Maiuri, he spoke with an Italian scholar who was an Indologist, and the Indologist suggested that this was Kharosthi. Now, Kharosthi is a Middle Indic, is a script that's used to write Prakrit, which is a Middle Indic language. I'll get to this in a second. But recently, there's been a suggestion that this is Brahmi, so the script, so it might be Sanskrit, but we're not sure. Okay, so what's Kharosthi? So Kharosthi is one of the many Aramaic-derived scripts. So Aramaic is an incredibly successful language, obviously coming out of the Levant. And you would not think that the alphabet, an Aramaic-derived language, would be used in India, but it is. And this is because Aramaic was the administrative language of the Achaemenid Empire, who controlled parts of Central Asia between 550 and 330 BCE. And it spread that way. So, in fact, you have Kharosthi scripts being used in China and Tajikistan, as you can see, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and also into India. And you can see that here's the comparison between Aramaic and Kharosthi. So this is a language that, if it is on the bottom of this piece, argues for a northern Indian subcontinent sort of derivation rather than Brahmi, which would be something further to the south, which is why some people prefer this idea that that's maybe what it is. And in case you're wondering, Aramaic derived scripts get found. So these are derived from Syriac. in places like Mongol, Manchurian, and Old Uyghur, which is spoken in Western China. So there's all of these. So Aramaic, as I say, is this incredibly successful language that just gets, the script gets, gets changed by people, as you see, gets turned 90 degrees on its edge, and it spreads all over. So if it's furniture, what is it, right? So is it a chair leg? So people have argued these things are chair legs or table legs. You can see this. This is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's heavily reconstructed. But you can see these sort of carved legs, for example, and we know they were carving ivory themselves in Pompei. So we actually have examples of that. So they were actually importing ivory into Pompei and actually making it. Now, in this case, we know this is from India, but it is interesting to see that there's actually craftspeople working with ivory in Pompei. So it's something that they were familiar with. My problem with this being a chair leg is, honestly, would you have something, I mean, these are kind of elaborate, but not super elaborate. Would you really have something that elaborate be down so low that you could barely see it? Is that likely? I don't know. I just have problems with the idea that, you have this fantastic piece, and would it really be that low to the floor and be a chair leg where you couldn't really appreciate it entirely? But it's difficult to say. By the time, of course, it's found, it was no longer, as I mentioned, a piece of furniture. What is interesting, though, just to sort of counter that, and this is much later, so I'm not trying to do an equivalent, but this does give you an idea that there can be these incredibly elaborate sort of chair legs or table legs or things that would be close to the ground. So these are ivory throne legs. These are just two examples from Odisha. So that's, you might better know it as Orissa, but it's known as Odisha now, from the 16th, 17th century CE. And you can again see very, very beautifully carved, really amazing pieces. So clearly, this is possible, but I'm not entirely sure. The other thing to keep in mind, however, is that it's likely it wouldn't have been white. It's likely that it would have been painted. So this is the other thing to keep in mind, because often when we see these things, when we see statuary, such as you can see here with these reconstructions, we forget that these would have been in color, right? That they wouldn't have looked the way they do now. They would have looked a lot different. In some cases, very garish. Actually, people take a look at some of these things and they're like, "Oh, what were they thinking?" But in fact, so we sort of have to almost train ourselves when we look at these objects to be like, okay, they wouldn't have looked like this, and they might not have looked like what we think they would have looked like also, because you hear painted and you think, okay, subtle. These aren't hugely subtle. And indeed, you can see painted ivories. Some examples here. We have a first century Roman example on the right, where you can see really elaborate painting. And then on the left, this is just an ivory from the medieval period, just to give you a sense of how the colors could have been. So it probably would have looked, as I say, very different than it does to us now. And of course, handling the figure would not have helped it. You can see here probably where people have picked it up. There's probably things like this. So obviously, if the piece was on display and people were handling it or they were looking at it, it might not have been fully painted by the time, it got buried. It's also interesting to see that there's an idea that Roman ivories may have ended up in India as well. We're not really sure when, but we do have this 16th century Deccan miniature, which seems to be imitating Roman and Byzantine consular diptychs. So you can actually see how it's going both ways, right? So it's not just that stuff is coming from Pompei. Of course, these whatever they're copying may have come much later. But we also have to keep in mind that this exchange is a two-way exchange, not just a one-way exchange. Now, not surprisingly, the statue has elicited a great deal of comment. This is just a few of the examples of what people have said about her. So Mayuri started out by complaining about her crude sensuality. And this is one of the things that you get over and over in this very sort of, quite frankly, Orientalist ideas about what people think this statue is, right? And so Vogel, writing in 1940, is busy calling it again sensual, carnal, primitive. Modi in 1957-59 is saying smiling sensuality. There's all of this that's going into this, right? So this figurine is taking on a lot, right? It's like it's not even, people are looking at it and they're basically passing judgment on what they think is going on. And as we'll see, there is absolutely no reason to assume any of the things that any of these people have said. And who is it? So this is the biggest problem. This is the current controversy that's basically occupying most people at this point. Is this Lakshmi? Is this a Yakshi? Or is this something else? Okay, so as you might have gathered, it's called the Pompei Lakshmi, but not clearly you've already gathered that people are not entirely happy with this idea. Lakshmi, of course, is one of the most important Indian goddesses, married to Vishnu, all of these things, and often found with lotus blossoms. And so this was one of these things that Mayuri in 39, in consultation with his Indian Indologist, suggested it was Lakshmi. Already in 1940, Vogel didn't think so. He thought it was a courtesan. So this is going back to the figure being sensual, right? So she must have some sort of, interesting position at court, right? That she's, some sort of courtesan, or maybe a Yakshi. So that's a forest spirit connected with trees. Or maybe a Venus Lakshmi, an ideal woman. In 2002, Parker said, I don't know, but not a Lakshmi. It's like, all right. Some people suggested, Basu in 2010 suggested a courtesan, a Yakshi, or a Nagini, which is a snake spirit. And then, as you can see, all of these people are making these suggestions. But should we think that's true? So if we look at Indian art, what do we see? So if we turn to the Satavahana period, which, as you can see, is a period when the Satavahana Empire was in control of basically what's central India, we can see a lot of material that is similar to the Pompei Lakshmi. But as we'll see, a lot of people haven't taken it into account entirely. So probably the most famous parallels from India that are brought up with the Pompei Lakshmi is Sanchi, which, as you can see, is in central India. And namely, of course, the stupas are earlier, but there are gates with decorations which date to the Satavahana period between the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE. And this Yakshi tree spirit figure is frequently brought up as an exact parallel to the Pompei Lakshmi. And you can see here, very, very similar, right? Lots of bracelets, lots of anklets, the girdle, all necklaces. Hair is not quite as elaborate, the big earrings. So very much in the style that we would expect. And people said, okay, on that basis, she's a Yakshi. We also have, also from Sanchi, although unfortunately now in the British Museum, another figure who's also, again, a Yakshi, a tree spirit, who you can see, we have the back, and you can see how elaborately her hair is plaited, right? And so it's very clear that it is extremely similar to the Pompei Lakshmi. And this is what's led people to say, okay, this is a Yakshi. You might also see she's actually dressed. So again, you can see the folds of the cloth here, and this will become important shortly. However, when you start looking at other parts of Sanchi, and when you start looking at other sculptures, what you start to see is that, well, quite frankly, everybody's dressed this way. If you're a high-ranking woman, this is the way you dress. So, for instance, we have what has now been identified to be Ashoka, the famous Indian emperor, and his wives. And you can see how his wives are dressed. Again, very, very similar to the Yakshis and to the Pompei Lakshmi, right? And this particular suggestion has now been based on the Kananganahali stupa, which we'll look at shortly, which is in Karnataka, where they actually have an inscription. So they're not just guessing this is Ashoka, it actually says it's Ashoka, which is very helpful, because normally, of course, nobody ever says what anything is, and then people make all sorts of interesting comments. And again, you can see they're wearing skirts, right? So again, it looks like, as I said, it looks very, very similar. And then in the gateway to stupa number 3, we have, and here's Lakshmi, now actual Lakshmi. So here's Lakshmi, the goddess, dressed again very similarly, but here's Queen Maya. So Queen Maya is the mother of Siddhartha, of Buddha. And you can see, again, dressed pretty much the same way. So what really seems to be going on here is that this was the style. this was the style that elite women wore. And so then when you're trying in this period, so then when you're trying to depict goddesses, tree spirits, whoever, you have them wearing the latest fashion, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that Yakshis are dressed in a particular way. Everybody who's elite is dressed this way. And again, we can see Queen Maya here again, dressed in the very same way. Now, some people have suggested that they're ivory carvers from Sanchi because stylistically it looks very similar, may have also carved the Pompei Lakshmi. We have an inscription that talks about ivory workers who did stone carving. So this is possible, but yeah, I mean, most people agree that the statuette was carved in central India, but the problem with that, of course, is they didn't use Korochthi there; they used Brahmis. So this also is a little bit problematic. So the Kanangahali stupa, which comes in Karnataka, you can again see the very similar figures from this period, from the Satavahana period. And you can see, again, the sort of people with the attendants, you know, all these kinds of things, very, very similar to the Pompei Lakshmi in the style, the dress, and the way that it's sort of conceived. You can see the smaller figures here, for instance, who seem to be some sort of servants or something like this. Stylistically, people also compared it to Amaravati and Najarakonda, which again are in central India on sort of the eastern side. You can see here. Now, stylistically, this is a bit different, but you can again see the similarities in dress. This is Queen Maya, Siddhartha's mother again. And then these pieces, this piece, which was found in Sri Lanka, which seems to be in this Najar Junakonda style. And then you can again see it here in Cleveland. So pretty much then we can say, well, all right, is this a Yakshi? Is this a Lakshmi? Is this a courtesan? Is this some elite woman? I don't know. And I don't think there's any way we will ever know. And I think that's okay. I think ambiguity is good. I know people want answers, right? They want to say it's this, but quite frankly, it could be anything. We just don't know. In the Indian context, this is an elite woman. Who she was, if she was meant to be anyone, we don't know. And that's the beauty of it. And in fact, that may have been the point as well. She may have been understood by different people in different ways. This is a figure that was meant to be viewed, don't forget. This is a figure that people were meant to look at. So how they understood it, how they saw it, you know, it's clearly conditioned by their own ideas. The other question is, though, how did the Romans view it? What did they think? Right? Because clearly this seems to have been a piece that was preserved, a piece that was put away, a piece that was presumably brought out to be looked at. How did they understand it? So there's been a recent book by Stephanie Pearson called The Triumph and Trade of Egyptian Objects in Rome, which is a very useful book and has fantastic illustrations, which a lot of which I got for this PowerPoint. And what she was looking at was, how are Egyptian objects viewed in Rome? Now, of course, Rome has a very different way of viewing Egypt, right? Egypt's much closer. They have a relationship with Egypt that's not, of course, the same. They control Egypt. They obviously didn't control India. So it's a question of, how did they see these objects? Did they understand what they were, right? So if somebody hands someone an Indian statuette in Pompei, would you know that was an Indian statuette? Potentially not. Certainly in terms of Egyptian material, because I mean, there's a temple of Isis at Pompei, for instance. So they're worshiping Egyptian gods. They have a lot of Egyptian imagery, so that they understood. Whether they saw this as something else, what they saw it as, is something that we're not entirely sure of. But what is clear is they like to collect expensive imported stuff. So this is one of three basically skiffoi, so drinking vessels. These are made out of obsidian. Now, if you think about it, how hard would it be to carve this without it shattering into a million pieces? And then it's inlaid with things like coral. Now, and lapis, you can see. I mean, this is absolutely, yeah, I mean, this is a staggering object. And there's three of them. Now, this is from the Villa di San Marco in Stabia. So this is, again, Pompei, but rich, like really rich people, as far as that goes, richer than the person who owned the statuette. But if you think about it, they're spending a lot of money. I mean, this would have been an incredibly expensive object. I mean, it's in Egyptian style. I'm not convinced that it was made in Egypt. The nearest obsidian to Egypt is either Ethiopia or Anatolia. So it's not as if it's coming from there anyway. But somebody spent a huge amount of money and time to carve this thing. And as I said, in a seriously wealthy context. So people are truly putting down huge chunks of change for imported objects. And one of the things that the book argues basically is that the Romans thought this was art, so they collected this as art. So they're not just collecting it because it's pretty or whatever. No, they appreciate these as art objects, like this incredible inlaid hydria, or this bronze table, which is inlaid with copper that's been patinated into different colors. This is the so-called mensa isiaca. So this was a giant tabletop. You'd eat off this thing potentially. So I mean, it's really quite amazing the kinds of things that they were really investing very heavily in, and even to walk on. So this is later, but this is from Rome itself, and you can see this very sort of Egyptianizing motifs. And there's some idea that they didn't make a distinction, that if it looked Egyptian, they thought it was Egyptian. So it didn't really matter if it was directly imported from there or not. And things like doors inlaid with tortoise shell. So this is a fresco depicting that, and you can see that here. So again, incredibly expensive. And we actually have a 3rd century BCE tortoiseshell box lid. This is a reconstruction. It does not look like this now. But basically the idea is this is inlaid with gold and electrum. And electrum is a combination of silver and gold together. And they also collected foreign statues. So not just the Pompei Lakshmi, but they also collected Egyptian statues, as you can see here. So there's this huge culture in Rome of collecting material and bringing it together and in the Roman world, and then looking at it, right? And actually seeing it as art. So we may not understand exactly how the Romans viewed the statue. They probably didn't know what it was. It's not clear if they knew where it was from, but they would have appreciated it as an art object, as something that was imported, was not Roman. They would have recognized it wasn't Egyptian. Whether, as I say, we don't know what they would have thought, but they would have seen it as being a valuable item. Now, the other area of controversy is the statue clothed or not? And this gets back to this whole question of, is the statue representing some sort of sensual Indian figure, right? So most people want the statue not to be clothed. This is just a cross section. This isn't everybody, but this is, as you see, most people fall onto statue is, and depending on your terminology, they either refer to the statue as naked or nude. But only 2 people, or well, 3 technically, have argued that I've found so far have argued that the statue was wearing any clothes. Now, as we've already seen, we've seen a lot of examples already of these women who are these elite women who, as you see, are basically they wear skirts which are secured by these belts and girdles. So these are, as you can see, statues of donors from the Satavahana period, from the Karli caves in Maharashtra. And again, looking again at the Lakshmi goddess at Sanchi, as you can see, again, you can see the lines showing that she's wearing a skirt. And then from the Ajanta caves, you can see this is from cave 17, so this is a bit later, but still gives you a good idea. You can see how they're wearing transparent clothing, right? And you can see that here. And this is a princess, by the way. So again, rich people wearing transparent clothing. And so if you look at the statue carefully, which I did, and Basu actually says she can see clothing folds, but if you look at the statue carefully on the legs, you can see what look like potential clothing folds above. You can see it coming down here. You see how it's draping and it's coming down the side, and you can then see it below here as well, and coming up. So there does, and the clothing, the folds of clothing that you can see here are from the servants, but you can see very clearly that it does appear that she's wearing clothes, or at least wearing a skirt. Also from Melih Hayrem in Turkmenistan, we have a similar thing where you can see, again, the statue is clearly wearing a skirt. And then again at Takshila in what's now Pakistan, you can see we actually have stripes, but you can see the legs of the figure through the stripes. So it does appear that she's wearing a skirt. Now you might say, well, why does it matter if she's wearing a skirt or not? It matters because, as I say, there's been this whole very Orientalist view of this statue as being some sort of incarnation of some sort of, Indian Orientalist fantasy, and indeed some of the comments about the figurine are quite frankly more revealing about the scholars themselves than it is about the statue and what their priorities evidently were. So I think it's one of these things where it does matter, because I think what we see with the material, and this was the thing that's really struck me when I've gone through the publications, and I don't want to give the impression that I feel like everybody approaches this statue from their own point of view, right? Everybody has their own point of view. My thing when I was looking at the statue was, how does the statue look like Indian art, and not just ivory carvings like this comb here from Takshila, but how does it look like stone art, but beyond the stone art from Sanchi that's usually quoted? Now, I should mention people like Modi already were aware of this and were already citing a lot of this already in their literature. But my interest was, how does it look beyond that? And I think when you look beyond that and you look at all these examples, and believe you me, I gave you fewer examples than I actually had originally. This PowerPoint was actually considerably longer, and I figured the last thing you wanted was, and here's another example next, and here's another example next. It's like, no, let's not do that. We can get a representative idea. So there's many other examples of women dressed this way, right? And once you start to see that, once you start to look at all the pictures, and of course we have huge advantages now, right? We can look at pictures on the internet, in comparison to a lot of the scholars who were working in the 30s and 40s and 50s, of course, had fewer resources to work from. And people pointed out, for example, that like the Yakshi in the British Museum, people cite it all the time. Why? Because it was well published, it was well known, it was in a European collection. So as a result, people were like, well, it looks like this. So this is one of the things why I think once you look at Indian art in detail, you can start to see this statue in a new way. So how did the statue get to Rome and to Pompeii? Now, this seems like an easy question, but it's not. So why it is seemingly easy is because seemingly what should have happened is that this statuette, produced in presumably central India under the Satavahanas, gets on a ship and goes happily along the Red Sea, goes over land, and then happily sails across the Mediterranean before it finds itself in Pompeii and gets covered in ash. Okay, so this would appear to be the solution, and indeed this is the solution that pretty much everyone has suggested. I wouldn't say I've read anything that is suggested otherwise. So let's look at why it may have gone the Indian Ocean route. So the Indian Ocean route is well known thanks to a book called The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. So this is a book which was written basically as a sort of handbook for merchants in the Roman period to travel along various routes through the Red Sea, as you can see, down the coast of Africa to Rapta. They have no idea where this is, but anyway, this is their best guess. Rapta is thought to possibly be Dar es Salaam, but we're not sure. But that's how far south. So we're talking far south is Tanzania, and then across to India. And so basically the guide gives you lots of information about, they trade this and they trade that, and they do this and they do that. And they give distances and status, which is a Greek unit of measurement. And archaeologists are obsessed. And when I say obsessed, I mean obsessed. They are obsessed with finding the cities of the Periplus in the archaeological record. So every time they find a site that looks like a port and has imports in it, they're like, aha. Now, if I look at the Periplus, and the Periplus says that this city is this many sailing days from this city, therefore I know that my city is mentioned in the Periplus. Personally, I don't think it matters so much, but for a lot of people, this is important because it proves to them that their site is important. And again, I'm not trying to say that it's not true, but short of inscriptions that tell you what the site is, it's pretty hard to tell. So it was written in the mid-1st century CE by an Egyptian Greek. It's preserved in a single manuscript, which is actually digitized. So if you want to go look at it, you can. Here's an example. This is obviously a later, recension. And as I mentioned, they're particularly interested with talking about, trade with India. And in particular, they have two major ports in what is now Gujarat, Babarakan and Baragaza, and then two major ports to the south, Muziris and Nelkinda. And you can see they've basically been identified here and there. So you can see basically this is, this was their interest. And pretty much half the book is devoted to trade with India. It was clear that this was for the Romans very important. They would sell things like wine, glass, metal, coral, textiles, Roman money, frankincense, and things like that. And in return, they would get things like, nard, which is an oil from a flowering plant. Here, it looks very unprepossessing, but here it is. I guess it was nice cloth, cotton, ivory. So people are like, aha, ivory is mentioned in the Periplus, ergo it must be, they must have traded it with this figure. Pepper was a huge thing. Pepper was like a massive import. Malabathron, which is like cinnamon. And of course, the Periplus talks about huge amounts of money being spent in India. And we know from Roman writers, they actually complain about how much money they're spending. They complain about how much money they're spending on silk. Some of the Roman writers are clearly very cranky and don't like nice things. So they're always complaining about how, it's a waste of their money. So the Periplus gives us this information. And if we look at the Satavahanas, so again, in central India, and we say, okay, so how does the Pompei Lakshmi stack up to anything that might be found there? So we do have, in addition to the stone examples that I was showing, we do have two ivory examples from India, from Tur and from Bokardhan. And so you can see in Maharashtra province. You can see here's the Tur ivory figurine. My apologies for the bad slide. Again, a lot of times finding pictures of these is not so easy, but you can see extremely similar, not as elaborate, but very similar in style. And of course, the hair isn't quite as nice, but still, somebody did go to a considerable amount of trouble to bring it up, braid it down. Maybe not quite as much. You'll see she doesn't have quite as nice necklaces, right? Her belt's not quite as ornamented, and she is missing the servants. So she's clearly wealthy, but not quite so wealthy, right? She does have big armlets, which seems to be fairly key. And with Bokardhan, though, you can see it's very similar, exceedingly similar. So you can see we have our two figurines, which are the servants. And then, unfortunately, of course, as is often the case, we don't have the whole thing. So we just have the lower part, but it looks exceedingly similar. Okay, so then the question would be, all right, so we have the Pompei Lakshmi. What else do we have that's being found in this area that might show signs of direct trade with India? So we don't have a lot, but we have more than we would have had a number of years ago. So we have what's known as the bronze Yakshi. So here we go, our tree spirit yet again. So this is in the Museum of Asian Art, otherwise known as the Frere Sackler in Washington, D.C., from the site of Korori in Oman. So this is a bronze figure from India. We have two ivory cones from the site of Dibba in UAE, with one of which has a figure very similar, again, in dress, although not stylistically similar, to the Pompei Lakshmi. So these are pretty much from the equivalent of the Roman period. And then slightly later, we have a 5th, 6th century terracotta figurine from Adulis in what is now Eritrea, but would have been part of the Aksumite Empire. And then recently was found this gypsum head of a Buddha at Berenica, which I believe is supposed to be 4th century CE. So we have a number of Indian objects being found around the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and up the Red Sea. So this would seem to point to this whole idea of, the trade which we know is existing, but also that the Pompei Lakshmi would have come along this trade. Further, we have in Socotra Indian inscriptions. So we have actual Indian people who are going with the material, because this is always the problem, right? When you have Indian stuff, it's like, are there Indians also coming with it? And a lot of times you can't prove that, because obviously just because something looks Indian does not mean that some Indian brought it with them, although people have suggested that for the Kor Rory statue. But in the case of Socotra, we know that there were Indians there because of the inscriptions. So Socotra is this insane island. Like, this is like, yeah, like I can't even begin. So it's incredibly isolated, and you could only sail there at particular times of the year, and then you would be stuck. So people presumably got stuck on this island and had too much time on their hands. And so what they did with their too much time on their hands was they went into a cave. And this was actually found by some Belgian spelunkers who were in Socotra because of, as you may have seen in the last slide, Socotra is this amazing island with all sorts of crazy things called like dragon blood trees and desert rose bottle trees, things that exist nowhere else, right? So if you're into like nature and walking and hiking and all this kind of thing, you go there. So they went there and they're exploring this cave, and then they're like, oh wait, what is this? And they found this cave, and it's full of inscriptions in all kinds of languages. And also they actually found it. I'm like, this never happens. I'm like, never, ever. But anyway, they found this wooden tablet written in Palmyrene leaning up against the wall, where presumably it had been put in the 3rd century CE, which is just, well, anyway, I mean, you know, this is crazy. But anyhow, so what they found in terms of the Indian material was they found from the 2nd to the 5th century CE, they found Brahmi inscriptions and also one inscription in Korosi, a total of 193 left by 117 Indian visitors, which, if you think about it, is pretty staggering in antiquity, right? So that many people, and who knows how many other people besides. So for example, here we have Bhatta Kumara, who's the son of Buddha Mitra. So we're also starting to see that we have Buddhists. And he and his friend, Bhattasena, son of Siva Mitra, leave graffito in the cave, and here's one of them. So we're now starting to build up this picture that, you know, it's all looking very likely, right? Looking very likely that Pompei Lakshmi was going along with ships. The ship may or may not have had Indian sailors on it, but in any case, that's what it looks like. However, that's not necessarily what happened, and we'll now explore why. So, in addition to the finds of Indian objects that we're talking about along the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and the Red Sea, we also have finds of Indian and other, as we'll see, imported objects in what is now Pakistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. As part of much of this, although not all of it, was under the control of the Kushans in this period. So they're basically the same time as, you can see, the Satavahanas. So the Kushans, basically, they also imported Indian ivory and bone items. And you can see that here. So Mellah Hiram, which we'll be talking about in some detail, has the all-important figurine with an ivory, as well as an Indian ivory plaque. So this is located in Turkmenistan, on the border, just on the border with Iran, as you can see. We have a bone comb from the site of Tilya Tepe in Afghanistan, another one from the site of Dalvergine Tepe, now in Uzbekistan, ivory comb from Takshila, and then many ivory objects from Bagram in Afghanistan, of which this is just one example. And people have spent a lot of time trying to compare the Pompei Lakshmi to the Bagram ivories, in part, I think, because, well, it's the biggest corpus we've got to compare it with. But as you can see, although the iconography is very similar, and they're dressed in very similar ways with equally, if not even some cases, more elaborate hairdos. I mean, these are really quite something. I think that's maybe a turban here. Stylistically, they look very different, right? I mean, if you look at the Pompei Lakshmi's face, you look at the way she's carved, this to me looks much more like the Amaravati and the Jarajakonda material that we looked at, rather than sort of things from Sanchi and elsewhere. So clearly related in the sense that they're all from India and potentially all from central India, but very much in a very different style, which is why I find the comparison, although useful, in the sense that you can say, look, it's all part of this great continuum of ivory objects. And in this case, from Begram, we know they had furniture and plaques and tables and chair backs and all kinds of things. So we know that they were used as furniture, and many of them do have Koroshthi and Brahmi inscriptions on the bottom. So this is one of these things, but it doesn't look the same. And one of the ones that they really like to compare it to are these three figures, which of course they again think are Yakshis, which maybe, again, we've already discussed all that, so we don't need to go through it again. But you can see, again, I think really not the same. I mean, as I say, coming out of the same tradition, but stylistically very different. And just to sort of make this clear. What is useful, though, is recent work has been looking at these ivory figure carvings and they've been doing work on pigments. So basically, if you look at, the large sort of green blue dot in the center, that's a pin. So that's oxidized. So ignore that. But otherwise, when they did X-ray fluorescence studies, what they found, and you can see the reconstruction on the far right, although this is not complete, the wings of this figure would have also been painted. They used various pigments, so hematite, vermilion, and importantly, indigo. Now, indigo is obviously important because it's coming out of India and is used in the textile dye and to dye textiles. And as we'll see, definitely probably is in this period, or at least around this period. So there very much has been argued that this, supports the idea that this material is coming from India. But probably the best comparison, other than the comparisons from India for the figurine of the Pompei Lakshmi, comes from the site of Meli Hiram in Turkmenistan. Now, it's interesting because in the discussions of the Pompei Lakshmi up until this point, people have been unaware of this particular publication, which I believe is from 2013. And so it's never discussed in relationship to all of this. So there's a lot of discussion about Begram, but people seem to be unaware of this particular statue, which in fairness was published in some article that was something like Meli Hiram at the Crossroads of Trade. So you might understand why maybe people didn't look at it, right? And didn't realize that, this was going to have this super important parallel. So this is what I find really interesting, because I think it has interesting implications for how the figure could have gotten to Rome or not. In addition, in this area, we have a lot of other imports that are found. So for example, this is, so at Meli Hiram as well, they have a Chinese mirror. At Tilya Tepe, they have a Chinese mirror and a Roman coin. At Begram, they have Roman glass. So this is an example showing, this is stone it's glass. The Pharos of Alexandria, and we have we also have Chinese lacquer as well as a Chinese mirror. So there's a lot of imports in this area which are coming either from Rome or from China. And indeed, if we look around the area of Kabul and Jalalabad, so that would be here and here, in stupas, they find coins of Roman emperors as well. So there seems to be this interesting connection with Rome. And the question is, how is it getting there? Is it getting there through the sea trade, or is it getting there through the land trade? Because obviously the ivory objects and bone objects, which are showing up at Meli Hiram, are coming from the south and are starting to head west. And indeed, if you start to look at what's happening heading west, and you can see all these numbers here, right? So 1, 2, so this is obviously we're looking at the Ukraine and Russia here. So what you can see is Chinese mirrors are found in basically what are known as Sarmatian contexts. So Sarmatians are nomads who are part of sort of the giant Scythian nomadic continuum, or whatever you want to call that, that's happening in this period in what is now Russia and the Ukraine. And you find these Chinese mirrors. So Chinese mirrors being found in Central Asia and then spreading across. So you can see some examples here. And then finds of lacquerware doing the same. So we already talked about lacquerware being found in Central Asia. Lacquerware also, the furthest west we have it up until now is at the site of Ust-Alma in the Crimea, so in the Ukraine, although currently occupied by Russia. And in the 1990s, they did the Ukrainian Institute of the National Academy of Sciences did rescue excavations, and they found truly amazing, because normally the lacquerware that's found in these nomadic contexts are cups, sort of drinking cups, this kind of thing. They found boxes, lacquer boxes at the foots of bodies in graves, and you can see reconstructions, and they put them back together, which obviously was not a lot of fun, I don't think, as you can see, found rather in pieces. And so this material, again, is going west, going through Central Asia as it's moving. And of course, you have Chinese silk textiles found in Palmyra in Syria, such as this example, which we know it's Chinese because there's a Chinese character. This is bright Ming. And then we have also Chinese silk textiles, an absolutely amazing piece, although it's not in great shape, but you can see from Hungary. And in case you wonder, okay, we have these fragments, what would this ball look like? So at the site of Moschovaya Balka, which is on the Black Sea, this is slightly later. So this is like 7th to 8th centuries. They found these absolutely amazing silk caftans, as lined with squirrel fur. I mean, just absolutely incredible. So, I mean, you start to get the sense of the kinds of luxury goods that are moving along the Silk Road, which of course is called the Silk Road. And importantly, also signs of Chinese people. So just as we've seen signs of Indian merchants, we have Chinese merchants on the Black Sea. So they found these Chinese documents. And again, we have Buddhists. So this is a Chinese document. This is a translation of either the rules for monks or nuns from the early 8th century CE. And so you can see basically, people are moving too. And equally, you might say, well, okay, so what are they sending back? They're sending back things like ermines, iron, all sorts of things like this. So this is from the tomb of Xu Xianshu, who's northern Qi from 571 CE. And you can see absolutely amazing objects. So things are moving, and this ivory could be moving over land. Now, I'm not saying it did. That's not what I'm trying to get at, but it could have. And I don't think we should really dismiss the idea that it couldn't have. I don't think we should assume that it went by sea. It could have, but as we see, lots of things were going over land, traveling far, far distances than the Pompei Lakshmi ever did. All right, so finally, this is all great, but what does it really mean? What was this really doing, right? Like, how can we imagine the Indian world from which this came? We've been looking at a lot of stone. We've been looking at a lot of ivory objects. We've been looking at some very bright textiles, but for the most part, you just don't get a sense of what that world was. But I think through the Ajanta caves, you can, specifically and mostly Cave 17. So the Ajanta caves are later. So these are the successors of the Satavahanas who we've been talking about earlier, the Vakatakas. And they, again, are in central India, but not controlling as much of the same area as the Satavahanas. And mostly this comes several hundred years later, from the 5th to the early 6th century CE. So it's not quite the same period, but I think it's very evocative. We already looked at some of the similarities. And these are religious paintings, again. So these are telling Jataka tales. So these are Buddhist legends describing the previous lives of Buddha before he became Siddhartha. So this is, when he was, a prince or other things in other places. So these are a whole series of caves, which were monasteries essentially. And these were explored beginning in the 19th century, and that has not been happy for the paintings, as we'll see. So you can see here sort of, they're very elaborate on the inside with lots of niches. These took a lot of money to build, and in fact, they gave up at certain points and stopped. There's some controversy about when the paintings actually date to. Some people want to push some of them earlier, but most people agree that they're from this period. I think one of the things that's important to talk about before we look at the paintings is the concept of the fact that these paintings were in darkness. So right now they're illuminated, but if you look at the entrance to cave number 16, you see nothing but black, right? So you would go into these caves and you'd be surrounded by darkness. we can get a sense of what this would look like if you held up light sources, right, in the caves in Ellora, which are near Ajanta, or the sort of dimly lit idea. But I think you would have some sort of flickering lamp, which would give the appearance of movement. And that's very important, because when we think about the way in which people would have experienced these paintings, we have to sort of think about what that would have been. There's been experiments that have been done on this kind of thing, trying to combine, light levels with lamps and this kind of thing. But the paintings were, as you can see here, incredibly busy. They had a horror of leaving anything not painted, right? So they just kind of went painting, everywhere, and paintings on the pillars, as we'll see, paintings on the ceilings, and incredibly busy, very, very busy, telling these various Jataka stories throughout time. And you can just see from this line drawing, because I couldn't get a picture of all of this together, but you can just see from the line drawing all of these figures doing all these things. So why should we look at this with the Pompei Lakshmi? Well, other than as comparanda to say, oh, well, okay, she's probably wearing clothes, this kind of thing. The reason I argue that we should is because this shows us what India, the context of Pompei Lakshmi, what she would have been coming out of, which would have been these incredibly, as you can see, bright, highly decorated, very, very colorful world, right? So you can see the palace here. So this is a palace. This is from the Vasantra Jataka. So this is the king. Here's his wife, and you can see just all these brilliant colors, greens and oranges and pinks and reds, and just everywhere, right? Is this sort of absolute riot of colors. And we looked at this earlier, but we can see it again. She has an umbrella that has blue and white stripes. It's like, and my apologies for the quality of the images. The images that I can get on these are not brilliant. It's very hard to photograph these. They're very sensitive. There's good reasons why we don't have great pictures, but you can get a sense. Just the amount of detailing is, quite frankly, quite staggering. And you can see that again here on these pillows. You have the servant who's wearing blue, who has a ewer. She has dark indigo here. And this is an apsara, or a celestial spirit. And you can see these amazing necklaces and headpieces with more jewelry and giant earrings. And just, as I say, this is luxury par excellence. This is, as I say, this, and you can start to understand why someone carved the Pompei Lakshmi when you start to see things like this, how she fits into this luxurious, and in this case, religious. Don't forget, this is a religious world that we're currently in here, religious world. This was how the Indians wished to portray the previous lives of Buddha. So what do? They call upon their own experience, and they create the world in which they lived. And you can see that again here with these amazing, textiles that they're wearing, just this very elaborate thing. My apologies, this is a terrible, this piece has not survived well. So this is a princess flanked with attendants. So again, very much like the Pompei Lakshmi. This is the unfortunate reconstruction. But anyway, you can again see the way, this diaphanous see-through robe, just as we've seen, flanked by these servants who are very similar. Now, not everyone appears who is wealthy seems to have worn clothing. So, for example, we have the dying princess from Cave 16 who doesn't seem to be wearing clothes. So, of course, I've spent all my time assuring you that everybody wealthy wears clothes. Well, potentially not entirely. Or this particular person who seems to not be potentially as well. And you can just see, not just in the carving, not just in the wall paintings, but in the carvings as well, this brilliantly festooned world. And the paintings were copied by by artists and British artists that ended up in the Victoria and Albert Museum. So you can see some examples here, not in great shape. That's what all the Japanese paper is doing there to keep the reconstruction from falling off. But here's the ceiling, right? So as I mentioned, this is just this riot of color, imagery, and all these things. And you can see that here as well. Or, for example, from Cave 1 with Mahajanaka Jataka here with the prince and his wife. And you can see all these amazing figures in these various clothing. And here as well, interestingly, he's sitting on a throne and it's not painted. So of course, again, I went to all the trouble telling you how I thought that the Pompei Lakshmi was painted. But in the cases of the furniture that you find in the Ajanta caves, it's not. So there we are. And you can see just this, as I say, it would have been incredibly wealthy, rich, and just, sort of like, if you can imagine, like, one can sort of imagine how overly stimulating one would have been if you entered into this environment and were not familiar with it. Now, we don't have textiles from India that can tell us about this and what they would have looked like, but we do from Baranika, which was the site we've mentioned earlier on the Egyptian coast. And they actually have pieces of cotton, which people have argued are similar to what we see in Indian textiles and on the Ajanta caves. And indeed, you can see these blue and white striped pieces, which do seem to be quite similar. Or potentially from the North Caucasus, we have this sort of silk scarf with gold on it. So really what I was trying to talk to you about today, what I wanted to sort of discuss is, this figurine is so much more than just what we think when we look at it. We can talk about what she's wearing or what she isn't wearing. We can talk about who she is. We can talk about how she got to Pompeii, but ultimately we're never going to answer that, right? This is something that we'll never know. But I think what it allows us to do is allows us to understand sort of how interconnected everybody was in the ancient world, and how, as I say, the Indian context of this material, how important that is to, I think, understanding this material. So thank you. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions. Do I need to stop my share, or is that good?
Stop share, Tasha.
Okay, yeah.
Please. I don't know, Tasha, did you do any research for today?
Just a little.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How big is the figure?
The figure is about this big.
I can't see your other hand.
Hmm.
So about 14 inches or so?
I think it's like maybe 9, something like that, or 11, something like that. Yeah, it's not huge. Okay. That's why they think it's a furniture leg. Yeah.
But they haven't found others that would, hold up a chair.
Yeah. No, that's all they found. So that's why I think that and as I say, they found it in a cupboard, which is by the time, so clearly by the time it got to be put in the cupboard, it was no longer a leg.
Yeah.
Okay. I have 2 questions, unrelated. One is, and I know nothing about this field, so take it in that context. But some of the Greek statuary is also thought to be elaborately painted.
Yes.
It seemed to me that I read that there are tiny fragments of paint, excuse me, that have been found, and I'm not sure what technology finds them, that leads people to think that there's paint. And the second question is, this seems to be, however you construct how it got there or how it got carved, I mean, it's very wonderfully carved. But you described the house it was found in as sort of a middle-class house. Mm-hmm. It seems to me unusual that, I mean, it would seem to be a sumptuary good in some ways, that it would be in that middle-class house. So these 2 questions have nothing to do with each other. But
yeah, so you're absolutely right. People have found traces of paint on statues. Some of them you can actually see. Like there's cases where you can actually see that they were painted, like the paint has survived, at least in parts, although it's usually quite faded, but there are ones where you can actually see it. But yeah, I mean, people use things like microscopes and things like this, where they find sort of minute flecks of paint. Surprisingly enough, I think now, even people, I think the digital technology is improving. So you can really, as I say, if you have good cameras as well, you can zoom in quite well. But you can do PXRF, which is basically so I'm not a scientist, so be prepared for a somewhat fuzzy explanation of what this is. But essentially a PXRF is this, it looks kind of like like a traffic, gun, right? Where that, you hold it by its handle and it has this like sort of elaborate thing on it, which instead of checking how fast people are driving, it shoots some sort of X-rays, I think, some sort of, anyway, some kind of wave thing, which if you know what you're doing, you plug it into the, it then analyzes the waves, and based on the wave pattern, they know what it's supposed to be. Now, we did this for some stuff in the OI for the exhibition I did in 2015, where I could see traces of paint on a pillar and it was red. And I'm like, okay, so what's this red? And they're like, it's lead. And people were very disappointed. They were like, what do you mean it's lead? That's so dull. So they were not excited by the results of this. They found it sadly disappointing. But yeah, so yeah, you can use either, as I say, either sort of microscopy or sort of scientific analysis to figure out what this stuff is. You can, of course, also take samples, but that's destructive. So people tend, for obvious reasons, not to like that. But presumably you could go to the Pompei Lakshmi and stick a PXRF gun in front of it and, go up and down and select some spots and see if she was actually painted, because there should be signs of it if she was. So if I'm correct that she wasn't originally looked like this, we should be able to figure it out. There also might be traces if you were to look at it with a microscope, but nobody's really been able to examine it close up that I know of. So there's that. And then you asked about the other question about why it was found in that house, right? So I think this is one of the reasons why people have suggested that this was a merchant, because I think that fits in better with their idea of sort of middling, although quite frankly, to be able to outfit ships, you had to be seriously rich in this period. So I don't really think that holds. This is why you often had groups of families and religious groups like we see later with the Cairo Geniza and things like this, because you have to share the risk, because shipping was an incredible risk, because your chances were your ship would sink. And we know this because we have a lot of Roman wrecks in the Mediterranean. So we know a lot of people didn't do so well. So yeah, it's not clear what it's doing there. Pompei is not, for the most part, not a wealthy place, and yet there are other places, things in like Herculaneum and elsewhere where you do. I mean, as I say, the obsidian, it's pretty clear it's a wealthy, very wealthy person, and the house is, so that matches. But maybe maybe this person. I mean, what's interesting is whoever this person was, they could afford a lot of glassware and a lot of metalware. So maybe maybe they spent all their money on this statue. Maybe they saved, but they were on the same street as a grocer, so there we go. So it does seem odd, yeah. And people haven't, I think, been able to come up with, I think, a satisfactory explanation for what this is doing there, because yeah, it's the only one we've ever found. So what do you do with that as well?
Thank you.
Interesting. Sherry, did you have a question?
You're muted, Shari. Shari, you're muted.
Okay, I was trying not to be during the talk. Do you know why? What happened here?
I don't know.
It ended up in the museum, in the naughty room, if you will, in the museum in Naples.
Yeah, because they thought it was erotic. They thought it was an erotic statue. I mean, I think who did it? Well, I mean, I don't know precisely, but Maiuri is already talking about it like it's an erotic statue. So I'm assuming he's the one who made the decision. I don't know. The Italian museum system is not clear on this.
Actually, Claire Bouffalus had a lot to do with it. She was the ambassador to Rome in the 50s, and she had been to Pompei and saw a lot of pieces that she just thought were horrendous, and they were all erotica. So she had them locked up. She had all the brothels locked up in Italy, including anything to do with it in Pompei. And then, of course, it ended up in a naughty room, in what she called the naughty room, in Naples.
Yeah.
She was quite thinking. She was really very
Mm.
strict in what she believed, and everybody had to go along with it.
Shari, can you move the camera because,
I don't know what happened to it.
okay, just keep fiddling.
I don't know what happened to me. I don't know. I'm here somewhere. It turned around. Oh, wait. Here's something. Ah, there it is.
Oh,
Yeah. And also just to answer your question, Alan, precisely, I just double checked. It's 9.5 inches tall, the statue. So
You know, Tasha, I think I love your presentations because I find 50 other things that divert me and will lead me down steps. I love how you put it in context, that you take me down a journey and then you say, okay, this is how the Janda caves, you see the sheer color that surrounds the Indian life. So of course, if it's coming from India, it just makes sense. It would have been colored, even if you don't do test ray X and the stuff. What I loved is how you tie up that the religion in India, even Buddhism, which is all about letting go, it's so voluptuous and sensual. You know, it just surrounds you. It's none of that asceticism and whatever else most other religions had. To see all that is really nice and say that, oh, this is how it would be. It wouldn't be like you had said. What I'd love, like I bug Tasha as much as I possibly can. And her description of the Alstorf gallery struck me. She said, when she sees it, what she sees, what did you say? A cave of destruction, because it's been pulled apart from where it should have been. So
Yeah.
instead of sitting there and cooing at it, the point is she sees nothing but destruction. That's what I had said in one of the emails. Your points of view are always eye-opening for me. You see things in a way I would have never imagined. Like to see that all these Chinese people traveled all the way into Ukraine. Well, of course it makes sense. They're trading. But the thing that one studies is that there were networks, Silk Roads were network connection. Nobody went all the way. Well, clearly some people did. And then the bronze mirrors, that they weren't mirrors, they would be very polished. So that's what you use as a mirror. The lived experience is what I always get from when your presentations go. And that's why I love listening to you. How did they live? How did this thing live? It wasn't a collecting item, it was part of someone's life. Like 500 years from now, you'll make up a story about my cup. Everybody else will be analyzing ceramic. You'll be like, this is what she drank. This is what she did. You make everything come alive. That's why I love listening to you.
Oh, I appreciate it. I mean, I think one of the things that I find the most interesting about this is that, you know, the piece itself is gorgeous, but what I want to know is like, why is it as it is, right? Like, how does this work? Like, you know, and I think for me, the Indian context is the one that just has not been explored as much, because I think, as I said, there's been so much emphasis on what it's doing in Pompei and being part of the Roman trade networks. And really, that was what I wanted to do with this presentation, was take it back to India, but then also look at, well, how could it have come another way? Like, because it doesn't have to just be, as I said, I mean, probably it did go by the sea route, but it wouldn't have had to have, as we saw. And, you know, who knew that there were Chinese lacquer boxes in the Ukraine? I mean, this is, you know, quite amazing, right? You don't expect these kinds of things, right? You don't expect Buddhist texts in the Black Sea. You know, people don't think, and this is all part of this, right? So some of this is several hundred years separated, right? But it's all part of this network. And people, you know, there's Indian sailors off the coast of Africa. There's, you know, and what's fascinating is then later in I think it's the 17th, 18th century, Gujarati sailors make their way to Socotra and leave Gujarati inscriptions. So it's like it continues, the cycles continue, and the same people go back to the same places, even if they never had any idea that they had, right? And that's the other thing, is that you start to see these, you know, these interconnections between all these people. And I mean, when, you know, with the Lakshmi, this is, I think, you know, because we have so much information from Pompei, we get a sense of it. But like, you know, it's clear this was everywhere. It's just what we have preserved.
I loved how you said maybe this guy or girl saved a ton of money for a long time to buy it.
I mean, maybe.
I really want this piece. I'm going to save it for a life, save all my money and buy that one piece. CCC collector.
Well, but also, if it's true that it was originally used as a piece of furniture and then it wasn't, what does that mean? Does it mean it broke and wasn't desirable anymore? You know what I mean? It's like it, you know, it's clear that it had multiple lives. And this is the thing that I think is interesting, is that it, whatever it was, by the time it ended up in this cupboard, it wasn't what it had originally been meant to be, whatever that is. And, you know, did that mean it was worth less or more or what? So,
But it was valuable in that it was saved. I mean, who knows where the other 3 legs are?
yeah, no, they chose to save it.
With
Yeah.
3 other customers.
Hmm?
You know, it could be that certain things were dismantled because eventually they were found to be more valuable in pieces than they were as a whole.
Mhm.
And so those legs, I'm just, because we've all seen folios of drawings which have been separate, which have been taken apart and sold in separate pieces. Who knows? Maybe those 4 legs were the dealer. A family, a Roman family, got into trouble by being bad investments or sumptuous life or whatever, and needed to sell off furniture. A dealer bought it and found that the legs were more valuable sold separately than they were individually, and could have been, I mean, it's done all the time now, and I'm sure it was done then. The money is what speaks.
Oh yeah, and maybe it broke on the way. That's the other possibility, is that, you know, somebody dropped it. I mean, people do that now. I mean, you know, it's like the Fatimid rock crystal Ewar vase in Venice that the conservator dropped and it fell into a million pieces, you know. Or the Qing dynasty vases on the in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, which were sitting on a window ledge. And I remember we're walking up the stairs and my husband turns to me because he knows I know Chinese porcelain. He said, "Those aren't real, are they?" I'm like, "Yes." But even I didn't know they were each worth £1 million each. Like I have no clue how much things are worth. But somebody actually, you know, fell and broke them both. So I mean, you know, so people, you know, people destroy, you know, or as you say, they, you know, the destruction of books to sell as pieces, or indeed papyri. I mean, there's the infamous papyrus eBay, which was actually what it was, is someone ripped the papyrus into multiple pieces, and the papyrologist would check eBay every so often to see as fragments would come up, and they were able to piece it back together. But yeah, it's worth more in pieces than it is on its own as a whole.
Merle?
Thank you so much. I found this incredibly fascinating. And I have a question about the hole that you said is in the top of the statue. Is there any way to know if that hole was made at the same time as the carving, or if it came later?
Yes, I've wondered about this also, actually. So the hole goes about halfway down to her waist, more or less. So it's not drilled through the entire figure, but no, there is no way to know when that was done. And indeed, I have speculated that, you know, I mean, in my mind, when I was thinking about it, I was like, well, how do we know that hole's original? We don't know. I mean, we're not sure. I mean, it could have been added. Again, the piece could have had, as you say, you know, it could have been reused as a piece of furniture, but wasn't originally meant to be that, right? So we don't know. We just don't have enough examples from India to really tell us. And I don't know that anybody's looked to see if the other pieces from India or have their drilled. I don't think that the piece from Mele Hiram is drilled in the top, but they didn't say. It's not well published. It was just, they briefly mentioned it and they're like, "Oh yeah, this looks like the Pompei figure." And I'm like, "Wait, what?" You know, because I saw this and went, what is this doing here? And, you know, why is no one talking about this piece? But, you know, again, as I say, the way things sometimes get published, this is why we all have to read as much as we possibly can, because if we don't, we'll miss out, because things like this get, sort of, tucked away in things, and then, and then it doesn't get into the record, right? And so then people just are busy talking about Begram when they should be talking about this other site as well. So yeah, it could have been added.
Penelope?
It sounds as though, from what you're saying, that this piece would benefit from a really close examination with modern techniques. I'm thinking of Merle's question, which I thought was an excellent question. Regardless of when it was drilled, it's unlikely that whatever was put in to support it or to support something else would be ivory. I would expect it to be some kind of metal, or so that would likely have left something behind.
Yeah, I mean, as we saw from the Begram piece, the pins, some of them are still there, right?
Yeah.
And even if it's not there, you can probably see traces of it if you know what you're doing. So yeah, I mean, what the piece would really benefit from, and given the huge level of interest, I mean, you may have gathered that from all the different people and all the different, and that's not even everybody who's written on this thing. It's, nobody's had the opportunity, to really, I don't know. I don't know how, so I don't work in Italy, so I'm not familiar with how easy it is or not to get into the Naples Archaeological Museum. This is always the thing, right? And particularly when you're trying, I mean, but I will say, like, in general, it can be challenging to get into museums to see super famous objects. And that's regardless of what any museum you're talking about. Now, it is true that I went to the British Library, and Shoma knows this story, but I went to the British Library. So not everyone's this concerned. So I went to the British Library, and I had never, I have looked at illuminated manuscripts before, but I'd never looked at Crusader illuminated manuscripts before. And there's this super famous piece, which has this amazing frontispiece with, Islamic influences and dancers and singers and musicians. And it's this incredible thing. And so I go up to get it, and I assumed they would walk me through what I was supposed to do, that they would, I don't know what I thought. And they handed me this book. I'm like, no, like, you can go sit down now. I'm like, well, help? Okay. And so, off I dutifully went, and I'm like, oh my God, now I have to open this thing. And, so, you get the cradle and you get the snakes, and, and I'm just going, oh dear God. So fine, because I'm convinced I'm going to drop it. Right. And that would not be good for it. And B, like, what am I doing? And it's scary. It is frightening to I once had somebody hand me a gold coin, and they told me and I was just like, and when they said how valuable it was, I'm like, I just, they said it was worth $500,000. And I'm like, here, please have this gold coin back. I don't wish the responsibility of holding this thing. But, so I think it's very difficult, right? To my mind, it's very stressful. I'm always happy when the conservators are like, you can't touch this, we'll touch it for you. I'm like, perfect. Please touch the object for me, because I don't want to ruin it, right? I don't want to be, through studying it, I don't want to add to the destruction of the object, right? So I think part of it may simply be, it may not be handleable. It's possible that because it's ivory and it's been pieced back together, and I don't know what kind of, you saw the slices, they probably used, and I know this from restoration stuff that I've looked at from this period, they probably use specific kinds of glues, which I don't know if they've been able to reverse that process. Oftentimes, and from this period, you can't. So there may also be reasons that you can't touch it, but I don't know. That's only speculation, but I would guess that one of the biggest issues would be simply how fragile it was. You might be able to do stuff with it if you opened the case and didn't touch it, right? You'd be able to do certain studies, you could do that. But, I'm not sure why they haven't done those yet. I think it's just a matter of, it may be that, as I say, it may depend on, a lot of factors that I'm not sure what they are. But I know with objects like this, it can be very challenging, just in terms of the sheer planning and, like, the fragility and, all of that, and let alone anything else of trying to get into the museum and how easy it is to do that or not. And as I said, I don't know that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Is it still in the naughty room, or is it on public display?
No, it is still in the Nadi room, although they finally ceased to call it the Pompei Lakshmi and finally are now calling it an Indian statuette of a like goddess. So so it's next to so I haven't been in the Nadi room in some years, so I don't remember very well, but it's apparently next to the Venus with bikini. So that's apparently where it is.
You talk about the naughty room. Is this the erotic room in
Yes.
Pompei?
Yeah.
I couldn't get over that when I saw it. That they actually have done that. They've isolated.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's the other thing that people sort of don't keep in mind is like, I don't think that the Romans would have seen this as particularly erotic statue, because quite frankly, if you look at the at Roman erotica, it's this is very tame. So I doubt they saw it as any such thing personally, but that's just me, and based on what I know about all the erotic art that is that from the Roman period is I think they probably just thought, it's some sort of figure and whatever, because but yeah, now it's considered that.
There are even rooms in the ruins of Pompeii. Each prostitute had her own specialty, and it was depicted on the wall. And Claire Booth Luce had cages made over these walls and with lock and key, so that the pictures, the paintings were hidden.
Yeah,
but you could pay the guard a few shekels and he would show them to you.
How much did you pay, Shari? You seem to know the right details with it.
And also, well, how many times have I been to Pompeii? 100. And they even had penises carved into the pavement, into the stones, showing you what direction to walk into to get to the prostitutes' rooms.
You must like those paintings a lot if you've been to Pompeii 100 times.
I used to throw my kids in the car and drive them to Pompeii.
Oh, I see.
Loved it.
Well,
It's fascinating.
It's
just fascinating to me.
It's fascinating.
So,
But I find fascinating too is that here we are again in Chicago trying to analyze a piece of Indian art that was found in Italy. And it reminds me of how so much of Indian art seems to be looked at out of where it was originally intended to be, where it was created, what it was meant to be for. We were in Jaipur, and our driver wanted us to see this little abandoned temple that was close to the maybe it's 20 minutes from the Palace Hotel. And so he picked us up early and we got up, it was out of town in the hills, and there was a police car there. And the Indian government can't afford to have guards on all its temples, all of its religious buildings. So the policeman explained that someone had come during the night and knocked the caretaker. It was like a janitor that lived next to the building that was supposed to be watching the treasures of the temple, and then proceeded to go in and actually off the goddesses that surrounded the top of the cupola. There were like 14 goddesses, and it disappeared. It's gone into the art market. And I think here's another example. There's so much of this that happens in India. There's just so much of the religious artifacts that find their way out into the art world surreptitiously. This through this criminal activity that I find it. I find it very upsetting, because of this I wonder, how did this get to Italy?
Barbara,
was it stolen?
Probably not. It could have been a regular commercial transaction.
Well,
But it didn't need to be. That's the thing. And that's, I think, the very good point that you're making is that, yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem in both India and Pakistan, particularly when you're talking about things from Pakistan and Afghanistan, Gandharan art in particular, where so much, I mean, basically, if you see it in a museum and it's not the Musée Guimet in Paris, I would be about 95% sure without even reading the label that it's looted.
Yeah.
And that's because the scale, as you say, you know, the Indian government and the Pakistani government have done the best that they can. But as you point out correctly, there's a lot of money shortages and there's just so much material, right? And that's, you know, and so they just can't, you know, protect all of it because it's just not possible. And that's not even accounting for the stuff they don't even know about, like this material I was showing you, the Kanangahali stupa in Karnataka. Those are recent excavations. And, you know, it's one of these things where, you know, we don't know what people have stuck a shovel in the ground and what they've, you know, hauled out as well, right? And so, yeah, it's very upsetting. I agree. Well, particularly when you see head after head after head of various, you know, divinities, whether it's Buddhist or Hindu, and you realize that probably the reason that you're seeing the head is that it was most convenient for someone to just cut the head off, kind of like what you're talking about, exactly that, and sell it. And yeah, it is deeply upsetting. I agree. And I think it is important to say, look, you know, it's possible somebody could have stolen this in antiquity. I mean, it's very possible. I mean, people did. I mean, we know that people, I mean, just to give an example, we have an example of, so, okay, the guy probably exaggerated, but we have a petition from the Roman period from Egypt, where the guy's complaining to the sort of local official, and he's like, somebody broke into my house. Well, he knows who it is. So he says, this person, I don't remember their name anyway, they broke into the house and they came in and they, you know, and they stole stuff from me, you know, and he wants it back, right? And so, you know, so I mean, you know, people stole things like they do now. So yeah.
You mentioned the Guimet. What is different about the Guimet?
Musée Guimet, they have material from Hatta, which was excavated. And so the material was actually excavated, so we know where it's from. Some of the British Museum material we know too, but Hatta for sure. So they have all these all this plaster, Buddhist plaster work, just tons of it, and that was all excavated. Now you can argue whether or not you should have stripped it off the stupas, but that's another thing. Personally, I much prefer if the stupas are left intact and are not, you know, I wish to experience the world the way I mean, I can't be like those people, but, you know, I can't be a person in antiquity, but you know, like the Kanangahali stupa, they left, as far as I know, all the materials in situ, and that's what I much prefer, because then you can at least start to get a sense, right? Whereas if it's gone, it's gone, and you can't see it in its context. You can't, it's like the Ajanta material, where you can see it in its context, which I think makes such a difference.
Yeah, no.
You know, if you ever want, I know this is recorded, when you have the time, and if you ever want to have lunch with Tasha, she can tell you a laundry list of museums that everybody genuflects in front of. We should not be. Their provenance is not there, yet they're one of the most respected museums around the world. So when you sit down with her and chat, and it's not recorded, that's when the conversations get scintillating. They're so much fun.
So the question I have is, following up on this is really not what you started with, but it leads to it. When did this concept of looting become so powerful? I mean, if you're not a Buddhist, you're not Hindu, you have no idea what that's really pretty, you know, and it doesn't seem to have, maybe it's been abandoned, or you know, you're picking up a pretty object. It's almost like picking up a pretty stone, which we don't do now. We don't take them from places. When did it start being viewed as a criminal activity to bring something back to England or bring something to Paris or wherever it was? Has it always been that way? I don't think so. I mean, I'm guessing.
Well, so, I mean, it's interesting because you think that people didn't care. But the interesting thing is sometimes they do. So for example, we have a travel diary by a Mr. Hyatt. This is who went to Egypt and Nubia in 1847, 1848. So I think he was in Egypt in 1847. Anyway, he ran into Dr. Henry James Anderson, who was an American doctor who was most famous for the fact that he married the daughter of Mozart's librettist. And so he was traveling with his son down the Nile. And so one thing that you often see on famous monuments, whether it's the pyramids or, you know, whatever, is people scratch their name on it. And you get the impression from that everybody did that and no one cared. Well, interestingly enough, Mr. Hyatt, who is British, comments on this Yankee and what is this Yankee doing defacing monuments with his signature, which I thought was really interesting because normally, you know, nobody ever says anything like this. And I was like, wow, okay. So already people are, you know, it's clear that there are people who have issues. There are people who have problems with it. We don't necessarily always read what they say, or indeed they didn't necessarily write it down, but clearly people were, in some cases, people were indeed uncomfortable. But it is the case, obviously, that, you know, lots of people collected lots of stuff. And, you know, I think really, honestly, at least from my experience dealing with material from the Middle East and North Africa anyway, is that people generally, up until I think really the sort of height of the Syrian civil war, to be honest, so we're talking 2014, 2015, it was at that point people started asking me about things like provenance and where things were from. And I very much had the impression that as a result of the activities of the Islamic State, which were very, and unfortunately very, you know, they were choreographed, right? It was done for show. It was devastating, but done for show. And done to be broadcast across the world. That was what they wanted. It's why they did what they did in the way that they did it, right? It's why you blow up Palmyra. It's why, I mean, not all of it, but, you know, why you blow up parts of it, right? It's why you go to the Mosul Museum in Iraq and hack at things with, you know, with sledgehammers and so forth. You know, you know, it's why the Taliban blew up the Bamiyan Buddhas. So I think at that point, people started asking more questions, and people started to increasingly say, well, so what, you know, where are these materials coming from? How did you get them? And so I do think that increasingly people are more aware of the impact of these kinds of things, and also the impact of if you collect, what that can mean, because obviously, you know, so I think it's just it's one of these things where I think, you know, I think people are becoming more aware of it. Let's just put it that way. And I think a lot of that's to do with actual media and, you know, and newspapers and coverage of this sort of thing, where people increasingly see. I mean, for example, they did a poll fairly recently about, you know, of British people about should they return the Elgin marbles to Greece, and, you know, actually a lot of people said yes. And, you know, and what people might have thought before, I mean, I don't know if they did polls earlier, but, you know, I think there definitely is an idea that people have this sense, you know, not everybody thinks this way either, but I think increasingly people care about where something's from. They may not necessarily think it should go back, but they might want to know where people got it from. And people never used to ask that question, never, ever.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, after all, cities have been sacked by marauders and governments for thousands of years. Objects have been carried off. You've got, as you well know, the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed, on, and you can actually see objects that are on the column, you know, in Rome, and it's you know, and even as recently as the burning and sacking and the burning of the Summer Palace outside of Beijing by the Americans, French, objects that were stolen out of those palaces are in the Louvre and elsewhere, and the British Museum is full of material that was taken shall we say, with the gun and whatever. And so then you wonder, well, if governments can do this and take all this loot, why can't the local indigenous population, who are often starving, sell these objects on the market and get food? Now, I'm not trying to make an argument for this, but I mean, this sort of, and the other question for those of us who don't, look, there was a very important carpet collection. I'm going back to textiles, which I know something about, that was just sold in Germany to the Doha Museum. And it was a very important collection of early Anatolian carpets that was going to be on the market. And then the day before the auction, the museum came in and offered the family who knows how much money to take it. I heard it was just announced that it went to Doha. Okay. I heard that it was sold to a museum. My first reaction was, I hope it was a European or American museum that this went to, simply because I know that I'm not going to Doha and to be able to see it. And there's and not that I don't want to go to that museum, which has an incredible collection of Islamic art. I don't want to go to Qatar. I mean, and for a variety of reasons. And now that I know that these objects have descended into that museum, I'll never see them again. Because I did see some of them when they were owned by the collector. It made me sad. And I'm glad that I can go to the Louvre and to the Guimet and to the Met and to the British Museum and see these things because I know that if they weren't there, I wouldn't see them. And in other aspects, to defend, wait a second. Many of these pieces would not exist anymore if it weren't for the fact that they wound up in museum collections. I certainly know that the carpets wouldn't exist because, and so I wonder, maybe the object doesn't really care how they got to a safe place.
I mean, I guess, I think it's not easy, right? It's not an easy issue for which there are necessarily clear answers. I think that, I think every sort of, look, no museum, okay, we can argue about the Benin bronzes and what's going to happen with those, but generally speaking, museums are going to keep the collections that they have, right? Particularly historical collections, right? Things that were collected in the 19th century, provided that they weren't, as in the case of Benin bronzes, actually taken in as, acts of war. Ethiopian material at the British Museum, similar issues. But okay, so let's exclude some of these, cases, right? Most of this material is going to stay where it is. Okay. So I think, to me, then it's more a matter of, at least from my perspective, is explaining how it got there, right? And being clear. And, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything, is going to be returned. I mean, we know it's not, nor necessarily should it, right? That's certainly from, I think it's not necessarily the case. As you say, the art obviously first belongs to the country it's from, and the people it's from, but it also belongs to all of us. It's our cultural heritage, right? And as you say, there's good arguments for having collections around the world. So I think from my perspective, I think we have to sort of look at everything together, but also we have to be clear about what is being, what's coming out, what came out before and why, what comes out now and why, and what it means when it does, right? And what it means for the British Museum, for example, to have this Yakshi sculpture from Sanchi, which I read this whole PhD dissertation, which was talking about this and other pieces in the British Museum and elsewhere in collections. And it was donated by a Mrs. Turner. And they're like, who is Mrs. Turner? And I was very sympathetic because my husband and I were working on some material which had been donated to the British Museum by a Mrs. Webb, which was equally unpromising. But in the end, you can figure out oftentimes who these people are. And then you get this huge, rich history of their own collecting, which is what we ended up doing with this with material like this. So, you know, you can definitely give the piece more context, right? So to my mind, you know, who's Mrs. Turner who donated this in 1820, you know, 1845 or whenever it was she did, or 1842, I think it was. It's like, this has no meaning. But if I suddenly know that Mrs. Turner is this, you know, wife of this guy who died on the ship going back to in India, and her going back from India to the UK, and her father was a wealthy indigo merchant, and he somehow got this Sanchi sculpture, and then she clearly unloaded it on the British Museum at the first opportunity, then it becomes much more interesting, right? It's like, what is she doing with this thing? You know, you're imagining this person on the ship with this Sanchi sculpture where her husband's died on board with, and his art collection is there. And then it's like, well, now what? Right. So you can, and in some cases we have diaries and we have letters. And so we do have more information about these people. So to my mind, also, you can use it as a way to get a lot of information, not just about the object and how it got to where it got, but like, why did people collect these things to begin with? What were they doing? What was the point? Yeah, Shoma.
I want to make a point clear, Barbara and the whole group. I like academic papers generally. I waited a long time to have Tasha present. I really did. Almost 2 years. I didn't know when this was going to start. Of all the people I've ever wanted to bring, I really wanted to bring Tasha. One, I wanted you to have a group that will appreciate what you actually bring to the table. And it's the same point that I made with the previous woman, Suzanne. More than anybody else, it applies to Tasha. It's not often, and it's very rare, when academics who work in museums and other places approach the subjects with such level of decency and pathos. It's just not done. And people like this always, more often than not, don't get the support. More importantly, the limelight that they need. Because to have Tasha run a museum, I would trust, even if the rarest of Indian items ended up in her hand, I would trust it much more than if it ended up in any Indian museum in India, because she would do it much more justice than anyone else. I would sign off on that. I would be much more comfortable, even the rarest of Indian objects, to be in her care, curated by her, anywhere in the world, because I think that's more important. She approaches things with such humility and a desire to learn and share that. It's never about, let me show, I, Tasha, found this. This is what I think. It's never done that way. It's so important. Over and over, I keep finding out there's never an imprint of her in anything that she does, ever. And to find people like that in museums or in paper is very rare. So anytime I find someone like this, I hardly find that person. So anything that you guys can do, she'll never ask me this. I want her to succeed in what she does. It's people like this who really make objects real. It's very hard to find people like that anywhere, in any museum, in any writing. It's never about, oh, look what I found. It's like, what does this mean about life? It's a complete different approach. Whenever you go to the Oriental Institute, just say, oh, is Tasha here? I want people to know of her, that people love what she does, that it's appreciated. I think it's so important to me, Tasha. I mean, this is my only little way I could do it. You approach things in an entirely different, kind way. You take both sides. It's so rare. I love it. Sorry, I just want to make sure I say that.
Oh, that's amazing, Shoma. Thank you.
I wanted to say a couple of things. What's wonderful about, what's wonderful about objects to begin with is that they contain stories. And that it's not just, you're not just looking at something for its beauty, but it's for its context, its story. I've always felt that museums, I had a museum exhibit design business for many, many years, and I used to work at the Field Museum. And I always felt that I want to see the exhibit that shows, this, and that not only tells me what it is and how it got to the museum and who owned it, but how many weeks of arguments did it take the curators to figure out what it was? And how many months did it take the designers to figure out what's the best way to, to actually display it? But because everything is much more, everything is deeper, or at least for this group and for people who really ask questions. It's a much richer world, to look at things from different perspectives and to ask a lot of different questions. But I have a specific comment in that. So I used to work for the Field Museum, which has a huge collection of Native American artifacts. acquired both legally and not so
so
much
much.
legally. Yeah. And and in 1990, the U.S. government passed the Native American Repatriation Act, which for the first time, I think, it made it clear that, okay, some of this material we really shouldn't have. It really needs to go back, to the tribes. But what I think is really interesting is that there is we have to look at the time frame, because when the material was acquired in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there were no Native American museums or archives, which means that, or very few, if any, which means that the material that was in those areas may or may not have survived to today. So the stuff was taken, cared for, taken in a way that was colonial and pretty disgusting, but it was taken and it was conserved and cared for. Now it can go back. So what's your comments? I notice a lot of people shaking their heads here. So
what I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dirk Obink, who rather puts pay to all of this. So, we have this myth that if we take things to the West, it protects it. It does no such thing. We know from both the Chester Beatty Library with David James stealing Islamic manuscripts for years, with Dirk Obink stealing the Oxyrhynchus papyri and selling it to the Museum of the Bible, and also taking, and we didn't know, we knew that there was we knew that there was a serious problem because they were claiming that they had very early New Testament manuscripts. And they were claiming that they were taking mummy masks, and there's actually video of this, although they took it down, but somebody enterprisingly made copies. Basically, they took cartonnage mummy masks and put it under water with a tap and disintegrated it. And because they knew, in the Ptolemaic period, which is of course pre-New Testament, which is important, but anyway, they had what was known as the papyrus monopoly, papyrus cartels, papyrus monopoly, and they basically they would reuse papyri as paper mache, and as a result, people figured out when they started excavating these that, oh look, because they were using papyrus in this way, that you could disintegrate mummy masks. People then stopped doing that because they realized that was a bad idea, and then these people revived it in order to cover up the crime of the fact that the papyri were stolen. From, at least, we don't know exactly because we're still waiting all the trials and all these things, but this is what it appears to be. I add this in case anyone wishes to claim that I'm libeling someone. But the point is that we're often very self-congratulatory about the fact that we saved things, but bad people are everywhere, honestly. Yeah. Wars are everywhere. So much was destroyed in World War II, for example, in like Berlin, when Berlin got bombed. Things that they brought back from China got obliterated. Things they brought back from Syria got obliterated. So I think we can't, at least, obviously, yes, things may have survived because people took them. That's true, but they're not necessarily better off. They're not necessarily safer, right? It's like I'm talking about material to you. I showed a picture of a Chinese mirror that's in a museum in Kiev. I have no idea what has happened to said mirror in the museum in Kiev.
That's true.
And who would have thought that would have been an issue? So, this is the thing. We can't, I'm very concerned about the idea that we should approach this from the idea that we're saving it, because who is saving what precisely? And we can't know what would have happened. We only know what did. So I don't think we can sit around and say that, look, people did what they did, right? And they're doing what they're doing. Okay. The only thing I want is for us to acknowledge this is what's happening. And I don't think we should take a stand on whether it was a good idea or not, because because I don't think we can, at least from my perspective, because as I say, things disintegrate, things get dropped, things get destroyed, and they get destroyed anywhere. And I think making the assumption that they're somehow better off here. Look at the museums who sell off parts of their collection, right? Look at, I mean, there's a statue that just went up, Dynasty 5 statue just went up for sale in the, I think it's Sotheby's, and Boston sold that years ago in the 70s.
The Shahnama that was
Yeah, exactly. The Houghton Shahnama, yeah.
ripped apart.
And that's recent. So again, it's, the Great Mongol Shahnama, same thing. These are all, so yeah, I mean, it's individuals who matter. It's the individual actors and what they choose to do with it, wherever it is, wherever it got to.
So should it go back to its place of origin? I mean, I think generally, if possible, it should.
I mean, certainly with things that have been recently looted post UNESCO, obviously I think we should assume, I mean, basically I do assume that unless something in an auction catalog has good provenance, you have to assume that it's looted. Okay. And as a result, it would be better if that didn't happen, but it does. And so I think, to my mind, what the most important thing is to educate people and make people understand that, okay, it's not that you can't collect things. It's not that you can't collect nice things, but think about what you are doing and what the implications are, right? I mean, I think I don't think we want to, as I said, I don't think that it's practical or that everything is going to get always sent back, right? And indeed, not everybody, actually, somebody at one point said they were interested in, they had something and they wanted to return it to Egypt, but they didn't think Egypt would want it because it was, very uninteresting, at least how they described it. And, I think it's one of these things where, the country of origin may also not be interested to have it back. I think it depends on what it is, right? But then you get in contested things, and it's like, and I think, as I say, I think everything sort of has to be looked at on, on the merits of what it is, how it got to where it got to. And, things can be worked out like long-term loans. I know the British Museum is talking about doing that with the government of Ethiopia. At least they were. I don't know what's going on now, because obviously things are a little bit unstable, but they were talking about the idea of actually returning. They were talking about the idea that they would actually keep some of these Ethiopian artifacts on, like, I think it was like a 99-year long-term loan, this kind of thing. So there are other ways of doing it that don't necessarily mean that the object has to go back to the country of origin, although it can, right? So there are various solutions that people have worked on this matter.
I just want to make sure nobody misunderstands. I was not implying that it was good that the stuff be taken, from.
I didn't. No, I didn't think you were. I just meant, I think it's just that we, I often hear people say that. So that's why I tend to be like, well, we need to, we have to be realistic about, what our museums are too, because our museums are not the be all and end all that sometimes we think they are in terms of security or, disasters. I mean, look at the fire at the museum in Rio de Janeiro that burned up.
I always think now, and Tasha's the perfect one to answer it. When you become wealthy, when a country becomes wealthy, say China, they come in and lop off the head of Pieta and take the head back and put it in a museum in China. That's exactly how I view these things. Sometimes I think it's the religious background of the people who go there. They look down on every other religion, every other culture, that there's some asinine nitwits. So let me just take what I want and bring it back. I sometimes think I cannot imagine, I could be dead wrong. I sometimes think the value with which you view other person's culture and just the attitude you bring to it often educates these, academics, because you're not bereft of your upbringing. I couldn't imagine someone thinking it's okay to go to, I don't know, I just said the Pyre, the Statue of David, cut the head off and bring it back and put it up in a museum somewhere, because that's akin to what I see. But what I also wanted to say, Alan, if you like the topic about the Native Americans, and I'm sure Tasha knows this, there's a ton of publication in the British museums that'll tell you, I think it's Yale or Columbia, when they talk about doing the right thing by Native Americans, they should be honest and realize the land that university is built on was acquired completely wrong, completely unethically. So if they're going to talk about we are doing the right thing, perhaps you shouldn't be where you are. Realize which law allowed you to take that land, get the money and pay for your edifice and get all the funding, which then you turn around and say, let me be benign and kind and ethical, and let me go and put up some statues about Native Americans. Take a step back and really look, how did you actually get set up there? There's so much publication on these things outside USA, and luckily we have access to all of it online. Lots and lots and lots of publication by these universities. It's odd that they do it in Cambridge or Oxford, because they can't be throwing stones either, but there's lots of publication around. It's really fun, not fun to read, but eye-opening to read.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, people like stuff. I mean, honestly, whatever period you're talking about, I mean, this is what we were talking about. Somebody liked the Lakshmi. They put it in a cabinet with all their other valuables, you know. People wish to acquire, and you can argue about why, but they do. They wish to acquire stuff. They wish to acquire pretty stuff, or, you know, whatever. And they wish, I mean, for example, I mean, and we can see this. So for example, Roman mummy portraits, which are very realistic face portraits, which were on portrait mummies. What they did was they took the portraits off. Why? Because it was easier to display it that way. So, because you could hang the portrait, the picture on the wall, right? You can hang an illustrated papyrus on the wall, right? It's not so easy to display a huge mummy in your living room, right? So you also have to, and you know, so that's the other thing is people tend to forget is some of this is like practicality. It's driven by practicality. But I mean, there's stories about, for example, during the Spanish Civil War, Hearst was acquiring a huge amount, William Randolph Hearst was acquiring a huge amount of Spanish material. And supposedly he had contacts, and what they would do is they would find out that, oh, this building has been blown up. We've heard stories. And then they would go, you know, there was this guy in Spain, and they would basically have people out there, you know, getting things basically on the ground as it was happening, which is really, the Spanish are not happy. There's some very interesting books. There's a very interesting book, which I haven't had a chance to read yet, but it looks super interesting in Spanish on Hearst and what was going on. But they definitely, you know, so when you go into like, you know, into, for example, a lot of Hearst's material, you know, ended up at the Metropolitan, you know, so when you go in there and you see all these pieces, these huge architectural pieces, you know, it's not just, oh, the building fell down, which there is that, but the building was made to fall down as well. So there's, you know, so of course it depends on the piece. I'm not trying to suggest that they were all acquired in this manner. They weren't, but it's something to just keep in mind that the Spanish, because apparently the Spanish Civil War, that's why there's so much Spanish material in so many collections, because of the Spanish Civil War, because that really spurred the looting of Spain, basically. Which, you know, again, we see that. And I mean, I fully expect, I mean, I don't know what's happened in the Ukraine with the area, you know, I know that the folklore museum was burned to the ground, so that the collection is lost. I don't know what's happened to some of the other museums in places in, you know, necessarily. I know with Crimean material, there was actually material that was on display, I believe in the Netherlands, when Russia invaded the Crimea. And it may include these lacquer boxes, I still have to check, but they actually seized the material and, you know, basically because it's like they couldn't return it to the Crimea. So they had to, so they kept it, right? Because they're like, well, we don't want to return to the Crimea because Russia's in charge of the Crimea now. And, you know, should it go back to Kiev? Should it, you know, and so it becomes this whole thing. That you start to see how war, you know, impacts these things as well. And that, you know, as I say, you wouldn't necessarily think, I mean, that's why when I go into the Met and I see all the Spanish stuff from Hearst, I'm like, so where did he get this exactly? You know, and I'm not saying it all should go back. That's not, as I said, it's not, I don't think that's practical, but I think we should also be honest about where our stuff comes from as well.
Thank you so much, Tasha.
Tasha, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you for your patience with all our wide-ranging questions. You may have anticipated things more focused on exactly what you were saying, just the Lakshmi, but
I warned Tasha about that in our conversation before. Anyway, thank you all. And Alan, I mean, you kicked off the salon with your warm story giving about your grandmother, and look what you made possible.
It's pretty amazing.
I know, I'm stunned.
2 years, 2 years. It's really amazing.
And I can't think of a better presentation to mark that second anniversary.
Right,
Thank you, Tasha.
right.
Thank you
Thank
Shelley,
you.
for introducing us.
Thank you all.
Bye.
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 Great day.